Now, if you're a pilot, it probably hasn't escaped your notice that English is not the only language being used on the radio. France is one of those countries where we have what we call a bilingual radio environment. And to find out a bit more about this, I've come to a French air traffic control centre. So let's go inside. So here I am in an approach control room. When we talk about a bilingual French/English radio environment, the first thing we need to look at are the regulations. Why is it that we can use two languages? What do ICAO say? ICAO say that radio communications can take place either in the language of the country, if both the pilot and the ground station speak that language, or by default in English. So if you speak the same language as the controller, there's nothing to stop you speaking that language, but if you don't, then you speak in English, which is why 90% of communications in ATC worldwide are done in English. So the next thing we need to look at are the French national regulations. What do the French national regulations say? The French national regulations say that the languages accepted in France are either English or French, except if an aeronautical publication says otherwise. And it also says that normally, except for training reasons, French should be used between a French pilot and a French controller. So that's the basic environment that we're operating in. So what determines whether pilots will speak to each other in English or in French? So normally in France, French is going to be used by VFR pilots 90% of the time, French private IFR pilots 90% of the time, French corporate jet operators, and Air France pilots are always going to speak French with French controllers, except if they are doing a particular training flight where English needs to be used. For example, Air France can renew their pilots' English qualifications in flight. So typically ATC will speak to those four groups almost exclusively in French, and then you have other groups of pilots. So for example, EasyJet, Ryanair, most of their French-based pilots are French speakers, but they will always speak on the radio in English, mainly because their standard operating procedures mandate that they must speak in English. And a couple of French companies only do their radio in English, including Corsair and I think French B. Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong on this one. So the typical radio environment is that French pilots plus Air France only in French, and then most of the other companies for commercial operations will speak in English. Another thing you might find interesting is that there is actually an official French phraseology which is published by the French DGAC, as there is an official phraseology in German, Spanish, Russian, Chinese. So English is a default language for communication, but it is entirely possible to have standard phraseology in French and in other languages. Although what I would say is that when you train as a pilot in France, you're not really taught standard phraseology, because particularly for the French PPL, when I did my PPL in France, I had no radio training whatsoever. Whereas when you do your PPL in the UK, you actually have to pass a separate radio telephony exam, which is why British pilots quite often have a more professional sounding phraseology than in French, for example. And in the French standard phraseology, they do have certain rules similar to what we have in English to avoid misunderstandings. So a few differences in French phraseology compared with English phraseology. Runway numbers. So for example, where we would say runway 23, so here in Bordeaux it's runway 23, in French you would typically say piste 23, so runway 23. Even though officially you should say piste 23, in reality nobody does. And another interesting one, quite often we avoid using the preposition to in English, so it's not confused with the number 2. In French we don't have so many of the same problems, but we do have a couple. So for example, the number 1, when it's pronounced on its own, is unité, because the sound in French is not a particularly distinct sound. And the other one that's quite interesting is when we have anything which involves the number 2, so deux, to not confuse it with the preposition de in French, we phrase the message differently. So for example, if I want to tell an aircraft to descend to 2,000 feet, rather than saying descendez 2000 pieds, I would say descendez altitude 2000 pieds, because descendez 2000 pieds, if I don't pronounce it correctly, could be interpreted as descend by 1,000 feet, as in remove 1,000 feet from your current altitude. For flight numbers and call signs, typically if you have a 4-number flight number, it will be broken up into two lots of numbers. So for example, if we had in English Air France 2234 would generally be pronounced on the radio as Air France 2234. So we break it up into two separate parts. So what are the pros and cons of having a bilingual radio atmosphere? Now, a lot of people, linguistic purists particularly, will say that it should only be English 100% full stop. Now, that's all very well in countries where English is spoken widely and people have grown up with English in their lives. In France, we're lucky enough to have an aero club system, a system of not-for-profit clubs where people can learn to fly for much less money than they would pay, for example, in the UK. Now, because it's so much more accessible, it's much less elitist than it is in other countries. And a lot of the guys who get their PPL, they fly for their entire pilot career, shall we say, without ever learning English and without ever needing to learn English, because France is one of those countries where you have so many destinations that you can have a very rewarding life as a private pilot without ever going abroad. So making English mandatory is going to alienate a massive swathe of the pilot population. And it would be a real shame if we were to ground guys like that by making some kind of arbitrary rule. So the first big argument for allowing French in certain situations is to allow the aero club system to continue to operate and flourish. Another argument in favour of it, and we saw this I think it was about 6 months ago. There was, I think, a 777 which had an engine problem on final and had to go around, and I think they had an imbalance in their thrust on final and had to go around, and they were having to explain some very complicated concepts to ATC. And obviously it was an Air France crew, and they were talking to the crew at Charles de Gaulle in Paris, and they said everything in French. Now, they were at the end of an 8-hour flight, they were tired, so in that situation, do you really think that making them speak in English, with the stress of managing the situation, the speed with which they can transmit the information, would it have been better to make them do it in English? I'm not entirely certain. Then on the other hand, the arguments against having dual language systems on the radio are generally ones to do with situational awareness. So it is very true that when you fly into an airfield where you've got two languages being used on the radio, if you only speak English and you don't understand French at all, there is going to be an element of lack of situational awareness because you're not entirely certain what the other traffic that you hear is doing. There is also an argument in favour of that for situational awareness for pilots. So what do the rules say currently about when you can and can't use French? So if you're flying in controlled airspace, speaking to an air traffic controller, you can use French or English. It's up to you, whichever language you want to use. If you're speaking to a FISO, or what we call an agent affiche in France, you can use English or French, but you have to be aware that some FISOs are not qualified for English, in which case you can only speak French. And if you go to an uncontrolled airfield where it's just air-to-air, or what we would call Unicom in some countries, then it's French or English, except if it says on the chart French only, in which case you're supposed to make your blind radio calls only in French. So what do I think about this situation? Now, it's very much a double-edged sword, because in France, culturally speaking, arbitrarily imposing English on everyone is never going to work, or at least not in the immediate future. For the reasons I gave before, to do with the flying clubs and the accessibility of aviation in particular. That being said, for commercial IFR operations, there is absolutely no reason why all pilots should not be communicating in English, at least in routine situations. There's no reason why they shouldn't revert to French in really emergency situations like the 777 at Charles de Gaulle a few months ago, because actually using their native language was probably more in the interests of safety than not doing so. But for routine communications around large airports, for commercial IFR operations, for en route IFR communications, there is absolutely no reason to use a language other than English, and at least it keeps everybody in the loop. When we go to smaller municipal airports, it's more complicated because you have a mixture of local VFR traffic with pilots who are not necessarily English speakers, and also sometimes commercial traffic. So it would make sense in that situation to continue to allow both languages. But again, for commercial operations at large airports, Charles de Gaulle, Orly, Bordeaux, Lyon, etc. There's no reason why you couldn't mandate 100% English communications. And in fact, in some countries, even where they have multiple languages, they allow only English regardless of your native language. Belgium is a good example. Obviously, you have Dutch, French, and German as the 3 official languages of Belgium. Also, you have to be aware that in Belgium, language is also quite a political topic, but they have mandated English for all radio communications. And in fact, I don't think there is a Dutch phraseology, so even if you wanted to speak Dutch on the radio, I don't think you could, because there isn't an official phraseology. So there we go. Little background on the bilingual radio environment in France, why it exists, and possible changes in the future. I hope you found it interesting. It's always a pleasure to read your comments and messages. Safe flights, everyone, and speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.